I have Caleb Amisi, who's the Saboti Member of Parliament. Thank you very much, Caleb, for joining us here on the show.
Thank you.
All right, first things first. You've heard the sentiments there of, your counterparts in regards to IEBC. They have this workshop that is currently ongoing in Naivasha. What will be your expectation from this particular workshop at the end of it just tomorrow evening?
Okay, thank you, Betty. Of course, as a country, as NASA coalition, we have a lot of expectations from the workshop. We say kudos to the IEBC first for organizing the workshop because the IEBC was really in shambles. And the country was worried that we have only 30 hours, just 36, 35 days to go, and the IEBC has not put the right infrastructure to enable a free election. So it was a good idea.
Right.
They put the house in order. It was a good idea to take a retreat, freshen up, make housekeeping, so that when they come back to Nairobi, they come back to business. They have set the stage for a free and a fair election.
All right.
So we thank them for making that step.
For making the move.
Yes.
And shortly also, I'll be speaking to my colleague, Sophia Wanuna, who's there in Naivasha, the Great Rift Valley Lodge, and she's going to be giving us the latest details in regards to that. She'll be joining her in a few moments. But just continuing with the conversation, what would you rather IEBC right now focuses on? Of course, we know that there's a lot of infighting and a lot of wrangles, as we've seen with the letter that Chebukati wrote to Chiloba. A lot of issues that they have, honestly, to handle. But what should be the priority? Is it looking back into the mistakes that were made with the August 8th election, or is it planning for a better October 17th election?
Yeah, first of all, Betty, I'd like to correct the IEBC, especially the chairman, Chebukati. When the ruling came out from the Supreme Court, it was very clear that the IEBC bears the full responsibility for the fraudulent election they carried. And it was not carried in accordance with the rule of law. So the responsibility was fully on the IEBC. And the first thing they were supposed to put their house in order immediately. What they are doing now is actually late. They should have sat down and find out where are they doing corrections, where are they even writing letters. They don't even know what is in the full judgment, because the full judgment is supposed to come in the 21 days, which is, I think, we are now for 14 days to go. So what is in the judgment is to say we don't want the chairman to conduct the election, and he's actually gone ahead to say we have only 2 candidates to take part, and the law says that you allow, it's not a rerun, it is actually a re-election. So you must allow and that's why you see the Dr. Okota has gone to court, because he feels that it's supposed to be part of the election, because it's not a rerun. It's only in a rerun where you have 2 candidates, the first and the second.
Right.
So this is an election never took place. The election took place out of the confines of on the constitution. So we want a repeat of the election, even new entrants. Right. Even me, I can actually vie as a president.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the first thing Chebukati has done is actually to break the very law the Supreme Court warned him about. So that is the first mistake. The second one is that we've seen Chebukati writing letters and saying that this must be answered by Chiloba, this one must be answered by so and so. So you are wondering, he was the chairman. He actually announced the results. So why did you announce the results that you've not confirmed all the Form 34A or whatever, the system, the server.
So are you saying that he shouldn't have
written the letter? In fact, if you are saying, the NASA, we are saying Chiloba, but I am also adding as an individual, both of them must go, clearly, because he's the chairman. He's the CEO and the chairman. So he bears the full responsibility, because he's the topmost. What he's doing now, he should have done before, because now he has put the country under a great loss. The business community are crying because of his mistakes. Because of
the mistakes of the commission.
Yes.
All right. Of course, you said that we're expecting the full ruling so that we could know exactly what happened. But what do you make of all these things that are being accusations that are being leveled against Chiloba? We really do not know. Of course, the Supreme Court pronounced itself, said that there were serious irregularities and illegalities to do with how the election was conducted, but we still do not know the specifics. Now, NASA, on the other hand, is saying that he's going to be moving to court to seek the prosecution of Ezra Chiloba. Is it putting the cart before the donkey?
Not really, because remember, NASA's evidence were presented to the court, and based on the evidence NASA presented to the court, that's what they're saying. The person who was most responsible, there are others who are also responsible, but the person who was most responsible for a fraudulent election was Ezra Chiloba, based on our evidence that we produced to the court.
Then going
so
back
it's
to
not, it's not because we know our evidence, and that's why the court was ruling based on our evidence. So that's why we have actually evidence to say Chiloba must go. Yeah.
Chiloba, but I find you contradicting yourself, because in the previous statement you've just said that both Chebukati and Chiloba should go.
That is my own. But the NASA's position is Chiloba must go. Because it's the NASA, the lawyers for NASA who presented, so they know where the responsibility lied. But in my own view, as an individual, as a leader, I think both of them must go. Also, responsibility lied also on Chebukati.
All right. Yes. Interesting. We'll continue with the conversation shortly. I can see Ababu Namamba is already here in studio. He's going to be coming on set in a few moments. But as we wait for that, and also remember, like I mentioned, we have our Sophia Wanuna who's going to be joining me in a few minutes to just discuss exactly what the agenda is of this workshop that IEBC is currently having in Naivasha. But before then, let's just focus on one or two other top stories. And President Uhuru Kenyatta will address a joint seating of the 12th Parliament tomorrow. The address comes amidst a sharp division between the Jubilee Party and the opposition following the nullification of President Kenyatta's victory by the Supreme Court. Jubilee Party, which won a majority of the seats in both the National Assembly and the Senate in the just concluded elections, is once again comfortably set to control the 12th Parliament. NASA MPs have threatened to boycott this seating. All right, let me bring in my colleague, Murimi Mwangi. Murimi, let's talk about this sitting. He's joining us from our City Center studio. Let's talk about this sitting and the fact that, NASA has threatened to boycott this sitting. First of all, what is going to be the agenda? Of course, it's coming at a time when, the election on August 8th, especially to do with the presidential election, was nullified. We're waiting for yet another one in about 35 days. So what really is the agenda of this particular sitting tomorrow?
Good morning, Betty. In an ideal situation where you have the legislature in place and a president in place from a fresh election, it is an opportunity for the president to give his agenda for his government and to try to marry that with the legislative agenda of Parliament. But in the current scenario, of course, President Uhuru Kenyatta will be addressing that sitting in his capacity as the incumbent president here. But of course, we expect that sitting to, in a way, illustrate what the Jubilee government would be seeking from Parliament in terms of legislation to facilitate the projects of the executive. You remember back in 2013, the president in his state opening of Parliament did mention that there was need to expand infrastructure, tackle such challenges as poverty and unemployment among the youth in the very first sitting of the outgoing 11th Parliament. And now in the 12th Parliament, we of course expect the same from President Uhuru Kenyatta. But of course, this is an interesting scenario given that we are in the middle of presidential campaigns ahead of that repeat presidential poll that is in only 6 days away. And a number of opposition legislators have expressed objection to that inaugural first sitting of the joint sitting of the two houses as called by President Uhuru Kenyatta. And part of their argument, some are saying that they are busy with the presidential campaigns. Others are saying that in the present scenario, to them, President Uhuru Kenyatta is a presidential candidate, just like opposition leader Raila Odinga. But of course, Parliament has made it clear that the president will be addressing that first joint sitting of the two chambers of Parliament in his capacity as president, and that is a matter of procedure. But of course, it will be interesting to see which opposition legislators turn out for that very important sitting of Parliament, because in a way it will inform what would be the development agenda of the executive tied to the legislative agenda of Parliament to facilitate that, Betty.
All right, just looking forward, Murimi Mwangi, what will be top on the agenda for Parliament once it officially begins its sittings? Just looking forward away from the sitting tomorrow.
Well, Parliament has in the past said that there are some bills that could not have been passed in the 11th Parliament, and the opportunity to do that is the 12th Parliament. Part of that bill that comes to mind is the gender bill. Remember, that bill flopped at the National Assembly. A separate attempt at the Senate also flopped. But this will be happening at a very interesting scenario when there are more women elected legislators, and of course even a number of governors that have been elected across the country. And therefore, for Parliament, the majority leader, Aden Duale, has said that that's one of the key bills that are in the entry of the 12th Parliament. But besides that, of course, there is more to do in terms of ensuring that the legislative work of Parliament, particularly now where the tyranny of numbers from the ruling coalition has intensified, does not turn into what was witnessed in the 11th Parliament, the infighting that in a way derailed part of the legislative work of Parliament. Betty.
Thank you very much, Muremi Mwangi, for the update there. He's been talking to us about that address that's going to be happening tomorrow in Parliament. All right, so we are focusing on quite a number of stories. That's just being one of them. Shortly also we'll be speaking to Sophia Wanuna, who's going to be joining us from the Great Rift Valley Lodge to just bring us up to speed with the workshop there that IEBC began yesterday to discuss really what the way forward is in regards to the October 17th presidential election. All right, so like I mentioned, I have two guests here in studio just to basically discuss the number of issues that have been, of course, on the front here in the country. I had introduced Caleb Amisi, who's a Saboti Member of Parliament earlier, but right now let me bring in also Ababuna Mwamba, who's a former Budalangi Member of Parliament. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us this morning. All right, so I was just engaging Caleb Amisi in regards to IEBC's retreat. It started yesterday. It's going to be ending tomorrow evening. What is your expectation of this particular workshop?
Really, I want to see the IEBC style up. They really need to style up. They've been spending too much time washing the dirty linen in public, as it were. When they have a huge responsibility, they got a historic, a very epochal presidential election to deliver in a month's time.
Right.
And instead of telling us very, very clearly that they're up to this task, they give us the roadmap and get down to the task. All this business of memos and letters.
Isn't that getting down to
threats.
the task?
I don't believe so. I think that is being engaging in sideshows, because at the end of the day, IEBC is an institution. And an institution must have a way of handling its own internal issues. And Chebukati, is, particularly as the chairperson, needs to know that he is the head of this institution.
Right.
The buck stops with him. And at the end of the day, these blame games and the back passing will really, in fact, it reflects very badly on him as the head of this institution. So I'll tell him, Chief, style up and prepare to deliver an election in a month's time. Yeah.
Interesting. So we'll get back to the conversation shortly, but just another development that we want to focus on right now is that the National Super Alliance will this week move to court to seek the prosecution of top election officials who it accuses of bungling the August 8th presidential poll. NASA lawyers are in the process of furnishing the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions with materials seeking to show how top IEBC managers messed up with the election, which was nullified by the Supreme Court. The officials NASA once prosecuted include the Chief Executive Officer Ezra Chiloba, his Deputy Betty Nyabuto Sungura, Elections Director Immaculate Kasait, ICT Head James Mohati, and Head of Legal Services Perxidis Torore. I wanted to bring in right now Paul Mwangi, who's the head of the NASA legal team. Paul, thank you very much for joining us on News Center. So let's put this into context. You want to seek the prosecution of Ezra Chiloba. First of all, what are you basing your evidence on?
One of the major things that we have against Chiloba is that he personally frustrated the process of the obedience of the court order. The court said that gave a list of things that needed to be done, especially in regard to the audit of the ICT system.
Right.
And by the time the trial was finishing, we had deliberately frustrated it to the point that we have a case now of total disobedience of a court order.
All right. And so exactly where will you be basing the evidence from? Do you have evidence really also to support further this prosecution that you're seeking against Chiloba?
Well, for Chiloba, we are taking this case to the Supreme Court. We have then other list of persons whose names we shall be furnishing on the DPP, together with what we believe is the prima facie evidence of their criminal conduct. And we are listing all of them, what we believe they did wrong, and how that constitutes an offense under the law. You know, now election officials have to take personal criminal responsibility for the things that they do wrong. And we are saying that unless you address that impunity, it will be impossible in Kenya to ever have a free and fair election until you bring people to book for the mistakes they make.
All right. Let's talk about maybe the ideal situation, because we're waiting for the full Supreme Court ruling to really understand exactly what the judges had against this particular election and IEBC and the way it conducted itself. Don't you think it's putting the cart before the donkey when you go to court right now, before we even get to understand really the issues, the fundamental issues, in detail by the Supreme Court?
No, this move is regardless of what the Supreme Court might say about the election. If you fill out a fraudulent form that the Supreme Court might not capture, or is very unlikely to capture that in its judgment, because the Supreme Court will not be dealing with every Form 34B or Form 34A that was fraudulently filled. Now, that is evidence that we have in our possession, and so long as the evidence shows that there is a criminal offense committed, then it is for the DPP to have it investigated. And that is quite beside the overall judgment that the Supreme Court may have or will have about how the election generally was conducted.
Finally, we also understand that you also are seeking the prosecution of 1,000 other election officials who, NASA is accusing of bungling the August 8th election. Who exactly are this 1,000 other people?
We will be providing a list. For instance, if you saw the memo that Chebukati gave to Chiloba, there are 538 election officials who refused to submit their results. That is an offense. We have many forms that were fraudulently filled out, and that is an offense. So we have people who were managing elections, yet they are not election officials. Those are also offenses, and that is what we want dealt with. The third issue that we are also pursuing is the issue against the French company, Safran Mofo.
Right.
And unfortunately, what the Communications Commission had told IEBC is that they should not take the server system, the cloud, outside the jurisdiction of the country. Because when a situation like we are in arises, the Kenyan courts have no jurisdiction over the company for what it could be doing in France. So we want to work with some organizations to take up the case to France and file complaints before French magistrates to have the company investigated for their role in bungling up this election.
All right. Finally, also, maybe just before I let you go, you say that you want the prosecution of Ezra Chiloba, but also Wafula Chebukati really is a man at the helm of the commission. Don't you find any faults that, you know, some of the things that even he mentioned in that particular letter to Chiloba, maybe he was at guilt?
No, once an order is served on an organization, the person who is supposed to ensure compliance with that order is the chief executive. That is very clear in the law. It's very clear in the Contempt of Court Act. And when an organization does not obey a court order, the person who is summoned to answer that disobedience is the CEO. And if he did not ensure that the organization or went out of his way to frustrate the obedience of that order by the organization, he is personally criminally responsible for that.
All right. Thank you very much, Lawyer Paul Mwangi. They are speaking to us. He is the head of the NASA legal team. Remember that NASA is expected to move to court to seek the prosecution of Ezra Chiloba, who's the CEO of the IEBC, together with a number of other commissioners and other election officials, over 1,000 of them, who, of course, NASA says bungled the August 8th presidential election. Let me come back to my panel of guests here in studio, and I'd like to start with you, Caleb, about, you know, NASA is moving to court to seek prosecution of Ezra Chiloba. First of all, what informed that?
Yeah, I agree with lawyer Mwangi. Remember when the Supreme Court ruling came out, it pointed out the areas where IBC had in announcing the presidential election. And it was not done in accordance with the rule of law, and they laid out procedures of the electoral process. So it is actually evident that the responsibility of a fraudulent exercise lies squarely on the topmost people. In this case, we are talking of Chiloba and maybe Chebukati. But remember, as I said earlier, the full judgment does not yet come out. So probably that is part of the judgment that is coming to come out, to say clearly who bears the responsibility.
But what
informs NASA?
But you know, NASA is already going to moving to court, even NASA, without that full
NASA is
determination.
Already going to court because somebody has committed an offense. And Chiloba, one, he was asked to provide the information that clearly did not, the server, the logs, and all that. So that is already disobeying a court order. So NASA have a right to go to court on the basis that somebody has committed an offense on two accounts: for failing to provide information as per the court order, number two, for overseeing a fraudulent exercise. Because if you don't follow the rule of law, yeah, that's basically committing an offense as per our constitution.
All right, Mr. Namamba, your take on NASA moving to court to prosecute Ezra Chiloba and other officials?
It is a red herring. It's a red herring. It's just part of the usual pre-election drama, the drama that NASA is so good at in terms of fomenting in the build-up to any election. I think Kenyans need to know that NASA is an enterprise anchored or constructed and anchored on the agenda of victimhood. Cry baby, cry wolf kind of mentality. And in Chiloba, they have constructed a scapegoat that must be used to like in the mode of a sacrificial lamb. So blame Ezra Chiloba for everything. I consider this premature, and the reason why I believe it's a red herring is because until the Supreme Court renders its comprehensive judgment in which we can be able to deduce whether there is any assigned individual personal culpability or responsibility, for that matter, responsibility that would lead to culpability, really you cannot start apportioning blame. Because even if you say that Chiloba takes responsibility for non-compliance with some court order, what are you relying upon? The court has not rendered any verdict to say Officer A or Person B failed to honor or to agree or to follow an order rendered by the court. And so I consider this really to be just part of the drama. And NASA would be best advised really to focus on October 17.
But by the time that the hearings were coming to an end, IEBC had not yet submitted what they needed to do. That is, of course, opening up the servers and giving the information that the court actually asked them to do.
Only the court, only the Supreme Court can tell us whether the order they rendered in terms of full disclosure or compliance was fully complied with or not. None of the parties has the power, the authority to render that verdict. Only the court can do so. And in its ruling, in its detailed, considered judgment, the court will be able to tell us on order A or on requirement B, this was not fulfilled, or a particular party did not fulfill or did not comply with the order given by the court.
All right, but remember that also during the ruling, Chief Justice David Maraga also mentioned that IEBC, and I quote, that he said they refused to give out information that was needed.
Now,
that was
in my
that
view, Betty,
ruling. Yeah.
What the Chief Justice in his wisdom is saying is assigning responsibility to the institution responsible for the elections. Now, for you to go into that institution and start apportioning blame within that institution, you've already identified, you've already isolated Chiloba, you've already isolated some 1,000 officers in this institution.
Right.
What is your basis? What is your rationale? What is your modus operandi in terms of isolating these individuals and assigning them culpability?
So you're saying that we should know exactly why
yes, we
it's
have
Chiloba and not Chebukati?
Why is it Chiloba and not Chebukati? Because as far as I'm concerned, Chiloba may be the CEO of this institution, but the chairperson, remember, unlike other institutions, like institutions such like companies, for instance, IEBC is an institution sui generis, as we say in law. It is an institution of peculiar or special kind, where the chairperson also bears executive authority. That is why the chairperson can decide Chiloba is going to be responsible for this today, or Chiloba is not going to be responsible for this particular matter tomorrow. And that actually explains why Chebukati holds all the chips in terms of responsibility for this institution. And so as far as who bears primary responsibility and where the buck stops exactly, the buck stops squarely and unequivocally with the one Chebukati.
All right. Caleb, it's good that you're here and, you're representing the views of NASA. How did you come about this list that, you're intending to prosecute, Betty Sungura and all these other people, Praxidis, Muhati? How did you come about narrowing down and singling out all these people?
Yeah, first, I think it's foolhardy. I disagree with my brother here. I think it's a lie to actually say NASA is making a premature suit, because the Supreme Court verdict was very clear. And at the time the Chief Justice was announcing the ruling, he said very clearly a failure of a respondent to provide the information as required. So it was very clear that the information was not provided. So the NASA is basing on that judgment that the information that that was supposed to actually be part of the judgment was not provided. So already that there is an offense on the part of the IEBC. And in terms of who bears the responsibility, I think the law is very clear, and NASA is basing on the IEBC provisions and what the CEO is supposed to do and what the chairman is supposed to do. And in this particular exercise, is the CEO, who is now Ezra Chiloba, who is supposed to provide the information as required by the court.
All right.
So that's why the person bearing the responsibility is the CEO,
all right,
and not Chebukati.
And not Cheb. That's what NASA is holding.
Yes.
And Ababu, just coming to you, do you think that just maybe Ezra Chiloba should just resign from this and have Chebukati bring in this team that he's already composed, that will lead us into a fresh and credible and verifiable election come October 17th? Because really he is, seemingly the man who is at the center of all the blame in regards to what went wrong on August 8th.
You know, Betty, we live in a constitutional democracy. Kenya is a constitutional democracy. It is a country governed by the rule of law. And the rule of law is predisposed on certain tenets. One of those tenets is consistency. We have a precedent not so long ago with regard to the Isaac Hassan IEBC, where we had a scenario, a situation almost mirroring this particular one. And you started this blame game against one Oswago, and you eventually got Oswago out. But then that did not stop the blame game. The cleanup or the purge, as it were, did not end with Oswago. And everybody felt that if there is a problem with the institution, it is not enough to target one individual in an institution where persons operating in that institution ought to bear collective responsibility. I have served in cabinet, for instance, and decisions taken in cabinet bear the seal of what is called collective responsibility. It is similar to an institution such as IEBC. And therefore, it took a spirited campaign to say Isaac Hassan and all the commissioners bore the primary responsibility. And that's what everybody felt. If you're going to reform the IEBC, if you're going to, excuse me, instill fresh confidence in the Kenyan public, then you needed to get the commissioners out. And so you got the commissioners out, you got the Chebukati team in. Now, in terms of consistency, you're telling me that now we want to forget the scenario that surrounded Isaac Hassan and his commissioners. And in this case, you want to lay the entire blame on one individual or a couple of individuals within the system, when in fact, decision-making within the IEBC. I had the privilege, Betty, of having chaired the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee of Parliament at the time when we crafted all these institutions. I also had the privilege of co-chairing, together with my brother Abdulkadir Mohammed, co-chairing the Parliamentary Select Committee that pieced together this constitution. And so I do understand both the letter and the spirit and the motivation behind some of these institutions. And for the IEBC, I know that the commissioners bear great power, great authority. And so if you want to alter anything, do not single out one person. My final take on this matter, Betty, is that Chiloba is being sacrificed. He's been targeted. And just to confirm how bizarre this whole scenario is, look at the affidavit signed by Chebukati in the presidential petition. And in that affidavit, Chebukati clearly takes responsibility for the institution. Why would it be that now, after the ruling, he's running away from the responsibility and attempting to shift blame and the blame to Chiloba? Actually, it is shameful and it's cheap.
All right, we're coming back.
Cheap and unacceptable, really.
We're coming back to the conversation, but for now, I'd just like us to link up with my colleague Sophia Wanuna, joining us from the Great Rift Valley Lodge, where IEBC is conducting that workshop until tomorrow evening. Sophia, thank you very much for joining us. So let's just get straight into the agenda of this particular workshop. Is it really to look back? Because, I mean, with the letter that came out last week, quite a number of issues came to the fore about, you know, the wrangling and the questioning between Chiloba and Chebukati. So this particular workshop, is it to look back and, of course, bring out the issues and reconcile these two people? Or is it to have a conversation and discussions around the next fresh presidential election, which is just 35 days? So what really is the agenda?
Good morning, Betty. As you said, we are at the Great Rift Hotel, and we are here to cover the Great Rift within the IEBC. And the main agenda, as you asked, is indeed to reconcile those issues emerging from the IEBC, the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. I can confirm just a few moments ago, we witnessed the chairman, IEBC, Wafula Chebukati, arriving here, and we know the meetings have since commenced at the conference room. So it's a retreat for the Commission to really iron out and deal with the issues that the country has been witnessing over the past couple of days. Of course, those issues hitting a crescendo last week, Betty, when that memo from the chair to the CEO leaked, a memo that raised very tough questions in regard to the August the 7th general election, more specifically the presidential election that was invalidated by the Supreme Court. And so questions in regard to what led to the issues that were witnessed then. But we understand today that memo may not be on the agenda. Why? Because it may derail efforts to bring parties to see eye to eye, parties to be able to actually have conversation. Because remember what happened is after that memo leaked, we then saw another statement from 5 commissioners, although one or two at the time had disowned that particular statement. One then went back on that disowning of the memo, or rather of that statement, to associate with himself with the other group. While we understand the other commissioner had said he stands on the side of the chair of the IEBC. So we hear from our sources that today, first priority, Betty, is for the teams. That's the Commission, the Secretariat, the key departments and their heads to be able to sit down and talk and bring out the issues that are emerging. But as far as dealing with the contents of the memo, that is not is not going to be a priority this morning and throughout the day here at the Great Rift as they converge and get down to even looking forward to that repeat presidential poll, Betty.
The memo really is not part of the main agenda. Isn't it just like sweeping dirt under the carpet? Because all these issues that were raised in that memo were extremely fundamental to the whole process, whether looking back or looking forward. So really, I mean, how is it then that, the memo will not be, the questions raised by that memo will not be part of the discussion of this particular workshop?
But it's largely seen as a question of you bring up the memo and you lose the point completely in as far as getting constructive conversations around and about the underlying issues in the Commission, because the memo was from the chair to the CEO. Our understanding is responses to that memo have been prepared by the CEO's office, but yet to be officially submitted. So to bring up the memo in a plenary, which is what they're having, really then is just to have a back and forth, and it will play out perhaps even as we saw last week when we had commissioners saying a different thing from what the chair had pronounced himself on. So it is not that they're ignoring it. I think the gravity of that memo is top of mind on every of the commissioners, or every of the secretariat members, IEBC as a whole. But I think there is a way in which they have agreed to approach it. So that first there is that of response by the CEO actually being handed in. And then after that, they're able to move forward, because to avoid an antagonistic situation, we understand from within that there is no more intention to keep throwing each other under the bus, because those who support the argument or are opposed to the chair's memo and actions, who support the CEO, argue that the CEO could in essence as well put the chair to task in his responses, because the issues raised, in a sense, also have the chair tied in, because the buck does stop with him. And the questions that then the CEO would pose is, with all these things not happening or failing, perhaps you are signing off on some of them, or you are aware of certain processes and procedures. So the chair then, in that sense, could not wholly absolve himself. That is some of the arguments we're hearing being made by those that are supporting the camp allied, like, quote unquote, if you like, to the CEO. So primary and of focus today, Betty, at least at the very beginning, is to get a cohesive team, is to get a team that can actually communicate, is to get a team that is focused, back on track, because that repeat presidential election is just 35 days away, as you said, and that must happen. Otherwise, there will be a constitutional crisis. So this is a team keen to build. It's sort of like a team building in essence. And I understand they've never had one since these commissioners came into office 7 months ago. Most of their meetings have all been work. So they're geared towards at least just reading from the same script, issues aside and everything else to be resolved thereafter. And perhaps most of those issues, like the memo, will be discussed and deliberated on further once they return to Nairobi. But for now, is to just iron out those very rough, edgy, crucial areas that have emerged and played out in the public.
All right, talking about those rough edges and the issues that they have been dealing with, one very important piece of information could be that ruling, the full one, by the Supreme Court. We're expecting that is going to be given in the next couple of days. So let's talk about them working without that benefit of having and really understanding why indeed this election was nullified. Of course, we know the skeleton reason, but they were waiting for that ruling that will give us in-depth analysis from the judges about what went wrong. So really, are we likely to see them having another workshop or other meetings that will be discussing and putting into focus the issues, the full details of the Supreme Court ruling?
Betty, and that's an issue that has come up in as far as many questioning. You remember that project team that was named by the chair to manage the presidential repeat election. Many asked, on what basis are those changes being made now that we're yet to receive that reasoned out judgment from the Supreme Court. But you could see, in a sense, some of this conflict, Betty, started emerging, or the rain really beating the IEBC after the ruling by the Supreme Court. Remember, the statement from the chair was that whilst there had been new commissioners before this last election, the Secretariat had largely remained the same. There had been no changes. There had been no, in terms of new appointments or movement in as far as personnel is concerned. And he had indicated that there would be changes, that this new election, the presidential election, would not be with the same staff as at least at the Secretariat level, and even went ahead to invite the DPP. So in as far as some of the things we are seeing happen, whether it's personnel change, which has been opposed by both sections or areas of the political divide, internally it has also caused a lot of discomfort. But what we understand with those changes being made is the realization that if that harsh indictment by the Supreme Court in their ruling, of course talking about irregularities and illegalities being committed, then that means some people committed those illegalities and irregularities were behind, the doings of individuals, and so there have to be changes being made, is the reasoning behind that. So yes, there is an understanding that they are handicapped in as far as not having that reasoned out judgment, which would give better understanding and clarity in as far as what they're doing. And we even had the chair urging the Supreme Court judges to make sure that reasoned out judgment comes out as soon as possible so they can clearly then look at those issues that had been highlighted or would be highlighted by the judges in as far as what they need to deal with. But this has clearly turned out to be quite the battle. The CEO on one side, the chair on the other side, and it will be important and critical and crucial to see, Betty, how this ends up.
All right, two last questions, Sophia, before I let you go. Also, just putting into focus this project team, we understand, of course, from last week, this new team was created to lead and conduct and oversee this fresh presidential election. With it, do we know the kind of influence that Ezra Chiloba, if any, will have still in regards to the election and how it will be conducted? Is it that he's going to be hands-off? Will we, even as Kenyans, get to understand, or will the IEBC Commission come out and say that, this is exactly who's going to be handling what, especially with, this commission, members of the Secretariat having been said to have been pushed aside. There are people who are saying maybe it was cosmetic, but really, will we get to understand who will be doing what with this project team being put to conduct the election?
So the project team, yes, was announced, Betty, by the chair, but that's, again, a contentious issue because commissioners saying they were not consulted. And what we hear is that it has yet to take effect. Of course, throughout the day today, we'll be seeking to find out if those members are here of that project team, although we do know, other than the Secretariat, the commissioners, senior heads of departments as well are here, so it's very likely that they would be here. But as to whether they've actually gotten down to work as a project team is another question which will seek answers from the IEBC meeting here. But you asked a question about the CEO and his role. It's important to note that he's not been fired. He has not been sent on compulsory leave, as those rumors at some time were indicating. He's still very well in office. He is the accounting officer, in essence, of the IEBC. So even these 12 billion shillings that the Commission is now asking from Treasury to conduct the repeat election, he's the person who writes to the Treasury to be able to get that money. And remember, a lot of what happens in an election as far as the details of it, the workings of it, that happens at the secretariat level. So to dislodge the CEO at this particular point is argued as a move that would put the Commission in quite a dicey situation. However, important to also note, you have NASA, the National Super Alliance, led by Raila Odinga, as late as yesterday and perhaps even today during their rallies, they have made it a point in their pronouncements during their rallies that they will not be party to that repeat election with Chiloba Ezra as the CEO, because they say he's the head of the secretariat running the election that was botched. And on the other side, in a televised interview, we're also hearing the Deputy President, William Ruto, last night casting aspersions on the chair and talking about night meetings with their competitors is how he described it. So you can see the politics of this, Betty, really being intertwined with the management aspect of running the election. And so messy, at least, to say about the situation that IEBC finds itself in. And confidence levels as well is worrying, because those then get to dwindle with Kenyans watching this debacle play out ahead of the repeat poll. And yet such a huge mandate rests their hands. So we will wait to get clarification. But what we can ascertain is that all the commissioners are here, the secretariat key officials and heads of departments as well are here, and they're hoping that at the end of this, it will not be the Great Rift anymore, but it will be a commission speaking with one voice, Betty.
Anuna, they're reporting from the Great Rift Valley Lodge about that workshop that is currently ongoing at the Great Rift Valley Lodge of the IEBC officials. We'll be getting to hear more from her later on here on the show. So we wanted to take a short commercial break. We're coming back, and I'll be continuing to engage my guests here in studio, Ababu Namwamba and Caleb Amisi, in regards to all those issues with IEBC, and also just looking forward, what kind of an election do we want as Kenyans come October 17th? All right, so let's take that break. We're coming back in a few minutes.